Your person didn't expect to miss you like this tonight. Wait. Pause for a second. Something quiet, something almost invisible has just shifted, and you probably can't name it yet. But you can feel it in the air around you tonight, like the room you're sitting in just got a little softer, like the universe took a small breath in your direction. Because somewhere, not too far from where you are, your person is sitting in a place full of noise and people and laughter, and they just heard something about you that they weren't prepared to hear. Not a confession, not a long speech, just a few honest words from someone else's mouth. And those words landed somewhere they've been protecting for a long time. If this message speaks to your heart, comment "I receive this love," like the video, and subscribe for more. Let me set the scene for you, because the details matter here. It's a regular night for them. Nothing planned, nothing special. Maybe a friend called last minute. Maybe a group decided to meet up. Maybe they just didn't want to be alone with their own thoughts again. So they went out. They put on something simple, something they didn't think too hard about, and they walked into a place with warm lights and background music, and the kind of low conversation that fills a space without really filling anything inside you. They were doing okay. That's the part you need to understand. They weren't sitting there thinking about you. They weren't waiting for a sign. They had genuinely convinced themselves that they were past the heaviest part, that they had moved into some quieter chapter where your name didn't pull at them the way it used to. And for most of the evening, that was true. They laughed at something someone said. They ordered a second drink without thinking about it. They let themselves settle into the rhythm of the night. And then your name came up. Stay with this. Because there's a deeper emotional layer here that's about to unfold. And I don't want you to miss the weight of what just happened in that room. It wasn't dramatic. Nobody made an announcement. It was just a passing comment from someone who knows them well, someone who has watched them from the outside this whole time, and noticed things they thought nobody was noticing. The third person, the one who said your name, didn't say it to start an argument or stir anything up. They said it almost casually, the way you'd mention something obvious. Something like, "You know, I always thought you and her made more sense than you ever admitted." Or, "I don't know why you stopped talking about her. She was the one who actually got you." Something honest. Something quiet. Something nobody else at the table even thought twice about. But your person heard it differently. The glass in their hand got a little heavier. Their shoulders, which had been relaxed all night, pulled in by half an inch. They didn't say anything right away. They just looked down at the table for a second too long, and then took a sip that was a little deeper than the ones before it. Nobody at the table noticed. The conversation moved on. Somebody started a new story. The music kept playing. But your person was no longer fully in that room anymore. This is where things quietly began to shift. Because here's what they didn't expect. And this is the part they're still trying to understand even now. They thought they had already done the work of letting go. They thought the silence between you two was a kind of ending, a chapter that had closed on its own. They had told themselves a version of the story where they were fine, where things just didn't work out, where life moved on the way it sometimes does. And they almost believed it. Almost. But you can't argue with the way your body reacts when someone speaks the truth out loud. You can lie to yourself in your head for months. You can rearrange the story 100 different ways. You can avoid certain songs and certain streets and certain hours of the night. But when someone else, someone who has no stake in the outcome, says a simple sentence about who you really were to them, your body answers before your mind has a chance to defend itself. And that's exactly what happened tonight. They sat there with the drink in their hand and the conversation moving around them, and they realized something they had been refusing to look at. They realized that the reason they stopped talking about you wasn't because they had moved on. It was because talking about you had started to hurt. in a way they didn't have the language for. So they just stopped saying your name, and without realizing it, they had let an entire part of their inner life go quiet. The part that knew, the part that remembered, the part that was never really fooled by the version of the story they were trying to sell themselves. This is where understanding slowly begins. After a while, they excused themselves. Maybe they said they needed air. Maybe they said they had to take a call. Maybe they didn't say anything and just stood up and walked toward a quieter corner. Whatever they said, the truth was simpler. They needed a minute. Because something inside them was rising. And they couldn't have it rising in front of everyone at the table. And in that quieter corner, with the noise of the place dulled down behind them, the memories started coming back. Not the big ones, not the obvious ones, the small ones, the ones that don't make sense to anyone else, but always meant something to them. The way you laughed at a joke they made when nobody else thought it was funny. The way you texted them out of nowhere on a random Tuesday just to ask if they were eating properly. The way you noticed when they were quiet, in a way that wasn't really quiet. The way you remembered the names of people in their life they barely talked about. They had buried those memories, not deliberately, but somewhere along the way, they had decided it was easier not to revisit them, because revisiting them meant feeling the absence of all of it. And tonight, all at once, the dam they had built started leaking from 100 small places. They didn't expect this feeling to return. Not tonight. Not like this. There was a song playing in the background of the place, faint, almost background noise. And it wasn't even a song that should have meant anything. But for some reason, a single line of it caught them off guard. Music does that. It bypasses every defense you've built and goes straight to the part of you that still remembers. They stood there in that quieter corner, looked at nothing in particular, and felt something hot rise up in their chest that they hadn't felt in a long time. Not heartbreak exactly, something more like recognition, the slow, uncomfortable realization that they had been wrong about something important. What happens next isn't loud, but it changes everything, because once that wall starts to come down, you can't put it back up the same way. They tried, of course. They went back to the table. They smiled. They picked the conversation back up. They ordered another drink, and this one wasn't casual anymore. This one had a purpose. They were trying to soften the edges of what had just surfaced. They were trying to push it back down to the place it had been living in quietly for all these months. But it wasn't going back. Not tonight. Somewhere between that drink and the next one, a thought slipped through that they hadn't let themselves think in a long time. Maybe I let go too quickly. Just that. Just one sentence in their own voice, in their own head. No one else around to hear it. And it sat there in their mind like a small, heavy stone they didn't know what to do with. And then another thought came. Why does this still feel unfinished? And then another. Why did hearing her name from someone else hit like that? And then, quieter than all the rest, the one they really didn't want to look at. Something about them still stays with me, and I don't know what to do with that. If this resonates, let it settle in you. You don't need to do anything with it right now. You don't need to text anyone. You don't need to make any decisions. You don't need to interpret it into something bigger than it is. Just let it settle. Because the truth is, what's happening on their side is happening on its own. They're moving through it without you having to push anything. The shift is internal, and it's already in motion. This is the part they didn't see coming. The third person at that table tonight, that friend, that family member, whoever it was, they didn't say anything that wasn't already true. That's the thing about honest words from someone on the outside. They don't create new truths. They just expose the ones you've been trying not to see. And what was exposed tonight was something your person had been quietly hiding from themselves for a long time. That they had measured every person who came after you against you, without admitting they were doing it. That they had felt your absence in moments they couldn't explain, and made up other reasons for the heaviness. That they had let pride or timing or fear or some mix of all three become the reason they didn't reach out. And now that reason was starting to look smaller and smaller. This is where the perspective shift begins. They were always good at telling themselves stories. We all are when something hurts. We tell ourselves it wasn't that deep. We tell ourselves we're better off. We tell ourselves we've grown past it. And some of that is genuinely true sometimes. But there's a difference between healing and hiding. And tonight, sitting in that place with your name still echoing somewhere in the back of their mind, your person realized they had been doing more of the second one than the first. You weren't a chapter they had finished. You were a chapter they had closed prematurely, with the bookmark still inside, because they didn't have the courage at the time to finish reading. And this is where understanding slowly begins to take a different shape. They started thinking about the last real conversation you two had. Not the most recent words. The last real one. The one where you said something honest and they responded with something safe. The one where you opened a door and they didn't walk through it. Not because they didn't want to, but because they didn't know how. And in the haze of the alcohol and the music and the slow weight of the evening, they remembered exactly what you said. Or close enough to it that the meaning was intact. And they remembered what they wished they had said back, even though they hadn't been able to find those words at the time. Stay with this, because there's something gentle unfolding here that I want you to feel. The thing about regret, when it's the real kind, is that it doesn't feel loud. The loud regret, the dramatic regret, the kind that makes people text at 3 in the morning and say things they don't mean. That kind is usually about ego. It's usually about wanting to undo a feeling, not actually wanting to mend a connection. But what your person started to feel tonight wasn't that kind. It was the quieter kind, the kind that sits in your chest and doesn't ask for anything. The kind that just makes you wish you had been more honest, more present, more willing to say the small true thing when you had the chance. They thought about reaching out. Of course they did. The thought passed through their mind more than once. They opened their phone, looked at the screen, saw the time, saw your name somewhere they hadn't deleted, and then locked the phone again. Not because they didn't want to, because they didn't trust themselves to say the right thing in the state they were in. And honestly, that restraint mattered. That restraint was a kind of respect for you, even if you'll never know it happened. What you need to understand is that what's happening on their side right now isn't about whether they message you tonight or tomorrow or next week. The reaching out, if it comes, will come in its own timing. What matters is what's shifting underneath it. Because the version of them that walked into that place earlier in the night was a version that had convinced themselves they were fine. And the version of them that will walk out of that place later is a version that knows they were lying to themselves. That's a real shift. That's not a small thing. This is the part they're still trying to understand, even as it's happening to them. There's a feeling that comes when you realize the timing of certain moments isn't accidental. You don't have to call it anything spiritual. You don't have to put a name to it. But you know it when it happens. The way certain conversations land on certain nights. The way certain songs play at certain moments. The way someone says something they didn't plan to say. And it changes the temperature of a whole room for one person who needed to hear it. That's what tonight was for them. They didn't ask for it, they wouldn't have chosen it. But it found them anyway, the way these things sometimes do. And in the middle of all of this, something gentle began to settle in. Not peace exactly. Peace will come later. What settled in was something more like honesty. The willingness, even if only for a few hours, to stop pretending, to stop performing okayness, to just sit inside the truth that they had loved you more than they had let themselves admit, and that not admitting it hadn't made it go away. It had only made it quieter. If you've felt a shift in the air today, this is part of why. The energy between two people doesn't fully sever just because one of them stops talking. The connection lives in a place that doesn't care about silence. It lives in the memory of the body, in the way certain names still cause a small reaction even after months, in the way someone can be sitting in a crowded room and suddenly feel a wave of something they can't explain. That's where they are right now. In a wave they didn't see coming. What changed in them tonight isn't going to look like a movie scene. It's not going to look like a grand gesture by morning. Real change in real people moves slower than that, and it moves underneath the surface for a long time before anyone on the outside can see it. But something has moved, something has loosened. And the next time they think about you, which will be sooner than they're admitting to themselves, they're going to think about you with a different kind of softness. Not the defensive softness of someone trying to be polite about an ex-connection. The real kind. The kind that comes from finally being willing to see clearly. Stay with this, because there's one last layer I want you to feel before we land this. The truth that surfaced tonight wasn't just about you. It was about who they've been when you weren't in their life. It was about the version of themselves they've been performing for everyone else. The friend who's doing fine, the one who's moved on, the one who's busy, who's focused, who's past it. And tonight, in a single honest sentence from someone who saw through all of that, the performance broke, not in front of the people at the table. They held that part together. But internally, the curtain came down. And what they're left with now is the much harder, much more honest task of figuring out what to do with the version of themselves that's still standing there after the performance ends. This is the version of them that knows, the version that remembers, the version that has been quietly missing you in ways the loud version refused to acknowledge. And as the night winds down, as people start saying their goodbyes, and the music gets a little softer, and the lights of the place start feeling a little too bright after everything that just moved through them, your person is going to do something very small. They're going to walk out into the cool air, and they're going to pause for a moment before walking to wherever they parked or whoever they came with. And in that pause, they're going to feel something they haven't felt in a long time. Not heartbreak, not regret exactly. Something more like clarity. The clarity of finally knowing what they actually want, even if they're not ready to act on it yet. And as for you, sitting wherever you're sitting right now, listening to this with that quiet ache in your chest that you've been carrying around like it's just part of you now, I want you to hear this carefully. You didn't imagine the connection. You didn't make it bigger than it was. You weren't too much. You weren't reading too far into things. Everything you felt was real, and everything you felt is being felt back to you tonight, in a way you can't see, but can probably sense. You don't have to do anything with this. You don't have to message them. You don't have to wait by the phone. You don't have to interpret every small thing that happens tomorrow as a sign. Just live your life. Keep your peace. Keep your softness. Keep the part of you that loved cleanly, even when it wasn't returned cleanly. That part of you is the reason this moment is even happening on their side right now. It was your honesty, even from a distance, that finally made the dishonesty in their own story impossible to keep maintaining. There's a quiet line from somewhere in the old writings that's been sitting with me as I tell you this. Something about how love is patient, love is kind, love does not insist on its own way. And I think about that line tonight, because what's happening in them is the kind of realization that only patient love makes possible. The kind of love that doesn't chase, doesn't beg, doesn't perform. The kind that just stays true to itself, and waits and trusts that what's real will eventually be recognized as real. So if you take anything from tonight, take this. The silence on their end was never the full story. The distance was never the full story. The version of events you've been trying to make peace with was never the full story. There was always another layer, and tonight a small piece of it surfaced, Not for you to do anything about, but for you to know. You are not forgotten. You were never forgotten. You have been living in the quietest, most protected part of someone who didn't know how to admit it until tonight. And admitting it, even silently, even just to themselves, is the first real step toward everything that comes next. Let yourself rest in that. Let your shoulders drop. Let the part of you that's been holding on so tightly finally exhale, because what they're beginning to realize now is something they can't walk away from anymore. Not this time.